Having a job offer doesn't prove you can do the job. And this is one of the misunderstandings that leads to the most refusals I've seen, where an officer states, "I'm not convinced the applicant is able to perform the duties required of the position." And this is a common misunderstanding you need to avoid, because if an officer doesn't believe you're able to perform the job, it's not a technical issue that you just forgot to upload a document. It's a credibility concern. And so it's going to be more challenging to overcome. And avoiding it in the first place is totally doable by following the steps I'm about to share. I see this reason for refusal even when someone meets the eligibility. So all of the work permit program requirements are satisfied, whether it's an LMIA or an LMIA exempt work permit, the person is eligible and the job offer is real. But these applications can still land in a refusal on the grounds that the officer isn't satisfied you can perform the duties of the role. And this is because the officer wasn't persuaded enough. And the belief that I've noticed most people have when they find themselves in this situation is that, well, if an employer has offered me a job and is willing to hire me, then obviously I'm qualified. That's not how IRCC works, though. The issue isn't whether the employer believes in you. It's whether the officer is satisfied. That's the legal test. And under Canadian immigration law, the officer decides what they find persuasive. So ability to perform the job can't just be assumed by the fact that you have a job offer. That's just a claim. You have to back it up with evidence. When an officer is assessing whether or not you're able to perform the job, they're asking a series of questions. And knowing these questions, you can include supporting evidence in your application to address them one by one. The first and most obvious question is, have you done the job before? And although perhaps the most obvious question that an officer will ask, the evidence applicants provide is often insufficient to address this question. Things like resumes and reference letters from past employers are supportive, but not enough. Resumes are self-written. You can put whatever you want in a resume. And employer letters, although a lot stronger than a resume on its own, they're still self-interested because you have a relationship with them. Now, I'm not saying don't include a resume or employer reference letters. Absolutely, these are 100% necessary, but they have to be backed up by more evidence, indisputable evidence, like payroll records and income tax records, licenses and certifications. If possible, other concrete, independently verifiable evidence to show that you performed the work you've claimed. Next, officers ask if your experience is recent, relevant, and logical. So providing the evidence isn't sufficient. You also have to connect the dots of how it relates to the job you've been offered, why it's relevant, and is the skills transfer logical? Inundating an immigration officer with evidence of past experience, but not tying it directly to the new role that you've been offered in Canada is going to lead to the same refusal. So an abundance of evidence itself isn't enough. The next step is now tying it to the role that you've been offered in Canada and making those logical connections, which is whether it's past experience in the exact same role or work in a related occupation that has skills that transfer. Make sure that is clearly explained, both in your own words, in the words of the employer that's hiring you, and also, if you can, to the best of your ability, with third-party data. If you have specific training and you can get your hands on the curriculum and highlight the specific learnings that you have that relate to the job you've been offered, even if it's not the exact match, showing that there's a logical skills transferability connection, and connecting those dots for the officer. Because if you leave it up to the officer to interpret the data you provide, the proof of your past experience or training or education, and you leave it up to the officer to interpret how that's related to the new role that you've been offered, you can bet that your chances of refusal are high. So don't leave that interpretation up to the discretion of the officer. Build it out with the evidence itself, and then build the bridge from the evidence and the experience and the training you have to the job you've been offered and how it's related, how the skills and knowledge transfer. And again, not just making claims, but backing it up with indisputable data and evidence. So if you focus on answering those two questions and backing them up with concrete evidence, your application is much less likely to get refused on the grounds that an officer isn't convinced you're qualified and capable of performing the duties of the position offered. And as I've alluded to, not all evidence carries the same weight. So I'm going to break it down very clearly, the hierarchy of evidence. At the bottom, the least convincing is self-authored evidence, like your resume. Needs to be included and needs to be consistent and supporting of other documents. But again, it's self-authored. You can put whatever you want in your resume. And so that's why it's at the bottom of the evidence hierarchy. Next on the hierarchy in the middle is employer drafted documents, internal documents from an organization, especially smaller organizations. And that's because, again, there's an interest there. There's a relationship between you and the employer. And so it's not 100% guaranteed that that is accurate. And the genuineness and authenticity of employer records or employer reference letters can be put into question. So that's what brings me to the top of the hierarchy, and that's third-party data. That's where we get into things like pay stubs that are run and through a third-party payroll provider, and income tax records that have been validated by a government body, for example. And then you also have your training. If you have third-party training, education, that documentation is also at the top of the hierarchy, the strongest. It's the most indisputable. And so making sure that you have as much evidence that falls into that, the top of the hierarchy, the strongest evidence is going to build the best application that's positioned for success. Now, I want to go through a couple scenarios just to bring some context and conceptualize the idea a little bit more concretely, because not everyone has decades of experience and now transitioning to a similar role in Canada. We have new graduates or people making career changes, and that's okay. It's just how the application and the employment opportunity are structured are really important. So let's take the new graduate, for example. An officer is going to look to ensure that there's training and supervision first and foremost, because if the role assumes that you're fully competent, then no matter how much evidence you provide, that could be a red flag that the officer refuses on, because typically a new graduate is going to need real world experience to be able to progress into a more elevated role. But that aside, you can still take experience from your education, whether it's an internship or clubs and experiences you had during your education, projects that you worked on, if you were part of an experiential education program, and how you applied the knowledge to real life scenarios, highlighting those components of your training and education curriculum and how they will apply directly to the role are really helpful. And now let's take the example of a career change. In this case, it really comes down to that narrative and bridging the gap from the experience you have and all the proof of that experience, and tying it to how it's related to the role you've been offered. So what training is going to bridge the gap and what have you already done? How and what skills transfer to the new role? And why does the role make sense for you now? What experience, what additional training do you have that makes this transition realistic? And again, without this narrative, this falls into question number 2, that realistic and logical. Without the narrative and the evidence to build the bridge from your experience to the new role, an officer is going to be left doubting your ability to perform the job. So if you remember just one thing from this episode, it's that a job offer is just a starting point. The job offer in and of itself is not proof that you're able to perform the role. And if your application doesn't independently show that you're qualified, that you have the skills, the experience, the training, the education to perform the job, the officer is allowed and is likely to refuse your application. Now, in the next episode, I'm going to cover something even more subtle. So even if an officer is convinced that you have the skills or the training to do the job, there might be one more thing that leads them to doubt whether or not you have the qualifications and you're able to perform the duties of the job you've been offered. And that's in your English or French language skills. We're going to jump into that in the next episode. In the meantime, to get more support and get templates and guides on preparing a work permit application that's going to succeed, log into Navio HQ. It's full of free tools that have been built by the experts at Navio, and all you need to do is click the link below. Again, it's totally free, and it's full of resources to help you succeed. And make sure that you are subscribed to our channel so you get notifications when the next episode drops. And if you liked this episode and know someone else who could benefit from the lessons, make sure to share it with them. And we'll see you next time.